All right, let's go. Keep going with chapter 8. Now we're going to look at the political structures of sub-Saharan Africa. Now I want to take a look at this picture. This would be kind of like a chief or maybe even a king in sub-Saharan Africa. And one thing we should take note is that the relationship between the rulers, like the chief or the king, and the people is not going to be that distant, right? And this is going to be very different, say, like the Islamic Empire or the Byzantine Empire, where the rulers kind of are like these supreme rulers, that are so much better than you, are so much higher than you are, than the common people. Uh, there's more of a gap between the people and the rulers. In Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, we're going to see that that gap is very narrow, meaning that the people have more direct access to the ruler than elsewhere. So I mentioned this earlier that family and kinship, right? People who related to you, distant relatives, you're all kind of living next to each other. Your family teaches you, your morals. Your family teaches you your ethics, what's right, what's wrong, and the whole village is kind of responsible for keeping you in check. So, for example, if you decide that you're gonna rob your neighbor and you commit that crime, the whole village has a say in how to punish you, right? That means that everyone's kind of looking out for everyone else. So if you're rude to your parents, or if you're lazy and don't want to work, right? Other people in the village have some authority over you. Everyone has authority over everyone else. And even though there's kind of like a leadership in the form of a chief or a council of elders, we're not going to see bureaucracies, government administrators. We're not going to see any type of legal code, or even let alone a written legal code. There's not going to be tax collection, right? Remember, tax collection normally was that the state charges a tax, they collect that money or those resources, and then redistribute it to laborers to construct things or to do a certain job, like soldiers going off to battle, or workers, building a temple or a church or whatever, or irrigation systems or defensive walls or whatever. But in these what we call stateless societies, there is no central government. There is no taxes, right? So how does a village, build a canal? Well, all the people get together, decide we got to build a canal, and they start digging. If the village says, we have to go fight, then the men gather up their weapons and they go fight. So there is no need for a government. There is no need for a central state. There's something we call stateless societies. Now, what eventually starts happening is as the population starts growing and these towns are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, the amount of land that they're going to need, the resources that they're going to need, is also going to increase. And that's going to start leading to competition between different villages, different towns. So that means more warfare. And therefore, we're going to see the rise of chiefs, right, gaining more and more power, because you need someone in charge of defending or attacking and conquering surrounding territories, because your population needs that land. They need those resources, right? So we're going to see the need for a military government kind of like form up. And the chief will kind of fill in that role as the military leader. And once the chief starts conquering the lands of other tribes, other villages, their power is going to be more and more concentrated, and eventually we're going to see that there's going to be the formation of kingdoms, right? And this is in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Everything below the Sahara Desert. We already know that there's kingdoms, and dynasties and pharaohs and everything else in North Africa, in Egypt. And we know that the Roman Empire was there. We know that the Greeks were there. We know that the Byzantines were there. We know that the Islamic Empire was in North Africa. But here we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa. So one of the first kind of like major kingdoms that we see is something called the Kingdom of Congo. And even though nowadays there's a modern or two modern countries that are called Congo, spelled with a C, this is kind of like the original, and it was in Central Africa, and the king had accumulated so much power by conquering so much land, that he declared himself a king. And we see that the first kind of like bureaucracies are created, with the military, tax collectors, law enforcement, that sort of stuff. But we will see that this state of the Kingdom of Congo eventually will get conquered by the Portuguese in Unit 4, right, in the 1500s. So this will be the Kingdom of Congo, right? And in fact, here we see the Portuguese arriving. You see the people throwing themselves on the floor. But up here will be the king, right? And now notice this compared to the picture from earlier, right? He is higher up. He's not just superior to you. He's physically higher up than in that other picture. So modern day Congo includes these territories, what we now call Congo and Angola. All right, let's move on to West Africa and the kind of there's a new trade network that is going to rise up. Now, this is called the Trans-Saharan, trans meaning across, right? So across the Sahara Desert, the trade network that went across the Sahara Desert, and this trade network had existed during the Roman times, but it was very minimum because during that time the camel, even though it had been domesticated, it wasn't in widespread use, right? It was only used by the Arabs. So camel wasn't used that often outside of Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula, which means that people traveling across the desert with horses or donkeys or something like that, it was very minimum amount because it was a very difficult journey. But we're going to see that the use of camels and the increased use of camels will kind of open up this trade network. And the people who are primarily responsible are a group called the Berbers. The Berbers are these nomadic people that lived in North Africa. And of course, they will adopt Islam when the Islamic Empire spread through that region. And they will adopt the use of the camel. And they're going to start using the camel to make the journey all the way to West Africa. So this trade network again had existed, but very minimum in the classical era of Rome. But it kind of expands during the post-classical era with the Islamic Empire. Right, so these are the modern day Berbers, right? And of course, many of them still live in this lifestyle, right? Traveling across the desert, living in tents, or living in small villages in North Africa. So what were they looking for? Well, the people of North Africa were looking primarily for gold, which is of course very valuable, but also slaves. They were looking for ivory, right, which comes from animals, from like elephants and hippos. And in return, what are they going to trade? Right, they're going to trade salt. They're going to trade copper. They're going to trade tools. They're going to trade cloth. Right, all these products from the Mediterranean region, which North Africa borders. And a lot of people, of course, question, why on earth would they trade gold for salt? And the fact is that we need salt to live, right? And if you live in a tropical region, which most of West Africa is a tropical region, you need salt frequently because your body will sweat it out in the tropical heat. So you need salt to preserve water. You need salt to preserve food. You need salt to keep a healthy water balance. That might be at risk if you get sick with all the type of kind of like tropical diseases like malaria that was common in West Africa. So gold for salt, right? Salt gold trade. They're also going to be exporting slaves, right? The people of West Africa, they're going to sell slaves. And the people in North Africa are going to buy these slaves. Because remember, under Islamic law, Muslims, as well as the people from the book, can't be enslaved, right? So that means that they need to go all the way to West Africa to acquire these Africans who are not Muslims and enslave them. So where are these slaves for? Well, they're going to be sent to plantations in northern Africa, right? And these plantation systems have been around since the time of the Romans, right? Back then we would have called it latifundias, but now we call them plantations. But these, that's the type of work they would have to do, these slaves being transported. The salt comes in these large slabs that are dug literally in the desert. Basically, the Sahara Desert had a large lake, millions of years ago, and eventually, of course, dried up, and all that salt's concentrated into these slabs, and You pack these slabs on the camels, and they will trade that for gold. The end result is that West Africa becomes really, really wealthy. Right? They already had a lot of gold in there as natural resources, but they're gonna increase their wealth through trade, and by contacting the Muslims in North Africa, by contacting the Berbers, by contacting merchants, and through contact with the Islamic Empire, with the Caliphate, we see that Islam is going to spread along the Trans-Saharan network, trade network. And the first people who will accept or convert to Islam are going to be the upper class. And these upper class people, of course, are looking to have political and economic connections with the elites of the Islamic Empire, right, with the caliphs and with the upper class people there. So by sharing the same common religion, they're going to have that kind of connection with the rulers of this massive Islamic empire, right? So the spread of Islam, remember, Islam starts here in the Arabian Peninsula. It will eventually spread throughout the Middle East, right? Spread across North Africa, eventually all the way to Spain, right? Southern Spain. And then it will spread southward, right, to West Africa across the Sahara Desert. Right, so in West Africa, we see the rise of these two states, Ghana and Mali. So Ghana is the first one, and they become wealthy because of the Trans-Saharan trade network, right? We talked about salt making its way into West Africa, where all these gold reserves were found. So Ghana begins to trade. They were originally, agricultural society. They begin to trade, and they will. They grow wealthy because they are taxing all the transactions. All these merchants coming into their territory had to pay taxes. And at the beginning, they reject Islam, and this causes conflicts between them and the Islamic Caliphate. And of course, the Islamic Caliphate is much, much, much stronger. And these conflicts eventually weaken Ghana, and it will get replaced by the next empire, the next state, which is going to be Mali. So Ghana would be the small territory here, right? So we have North Africa up here. These people would be, trading across the desert. They did have this city called Jano, major city, and here we see one of their mosques. And notice how the mosque, might have these tall towers, which is, typical of Islamic architecture. But the building material and the design, right, is very, very different than what we would see in, places like Baghdad or places like Cairo or Cordoba in Spain. Very different type of architecture, but they are mosques, just like any other mosque in the Islamic world. So we see another empire rise, and that's going to be the Empire of Mali, and they're going to have this major, huge city called Timbuktu. So the founder of Mali is this guy called Sundiata, and in fact, the story of the Lion King is based on a literature called the Epic of Sundiata. So there's a lot of similarities and parallelism between the Lion King and what was nicknamed the Lion Prince, which was Sundiata. And they lived around the Niger River, that's how it's pronounced, Niger. And that, of course, is where all their gold is coming from. And they're going to build the city, Timbuktu. They're going to make it huge. They're going to make it great. It's going to have it's basically going to be the largest city in sub-Saharan Africa. They're going to have universities, they're going to have palaces and mosques, and it will grow even greater under the rule of Sundiata's grandnephew, called Mansa Musa, right? And he was in one of other West African mosques. So here we see another mosque once again. Right, so we see the same kind of design in different places throughout West Africa, but they're all mosques, and they're all have kind of the traditional West African architectural styles. All right, so here we have Mansa Musa, right? So Mansa Musa is the grand nephew of Sundiata, and he is a devout Muslim. He will go on the pilgrimage, right? He's going to travel from West Africa all the way to Cairo, and then all the way to to Saudi Arabia. And Mansa Musa is going to go on the pilgrimage of the Hajj, right, which is one of those five pillars of Islam, right? Muslims have to make a pilgrimage to Mecca once in their lifetime. And he does not come alone. He brings thousands of slaves. He brings hundreds of camels, all of them carrying gold. And he kind of just distributes this mass wealth everywhere he goes, giving lavish gifts to everyone who hosts him, as their guest. And the story is that he gives away so much gold that he actually causes an inflation of gold, meaning that the supply had increased so much that its value actually dropped. And it took years and years and years before the economy of Cairo recovered from Mansa Musa's generosity. So here we see the emperor being carried by servants and soldiers. So Musa, he more than anyone else is credited for popularizing Islam. So after he returns from his trip to Mecca, he brings with him these doctors and these scholars and professors and engineers and mathematicians and scientists. He hires all these people to come back with him to build more schools and palaces and mosques, and to provide healthcare for his people and to educate people in Islam so that they can read and write in Arabic. And he kind of like increases the prestige and the greatness that was Timbuktu. And as the people of West Africa see all these great things being, brought home by their emperor, and they see, of course, that the emperor is Muslim, we see that there is an increased popularity of people converting to Islam. And even nowadays, we see that most of West Africa is still predominantly Muslim. All right, so education, healthcare, all these different services were provided by Mansa Musa. All right, on the other side of Africa, we have another trade network called the Indian Ocean Maritime Trade Network. And East Africa is going to be one of the major players in this trade network. The East Coast, or we also call the Swahili Coast. Now, keep in mind, of course, that the Indian Ocean Trade Network had been around since even before the classical era, right, during the foundations, right, where Mesopotamian merchants were sailing all the way to the Indus Valley, right, at its most limited or minimum level. Right, this is where that trade network started, with the with the Han in China, with the Guptas and the Mauryans in India, with the Persians, right, the Achaemenids, with the Greeks in Alexandria. We're going to see in the classical era that this trade network will be expanded. Then we see that there's going to be a collapse, right, with the fall of the Guptas, with the fall of the Romans, with the fall of the Han, right. This trade network will go into a decline. But with the birth of the Islamic Empire and expansion, we're going to see that India and China are also going to revitalize their governments. And we see this trade network kind of come back once again, and now East Africa is going to be one of those major players. So Muslims are Arabs are kind of credited for the resurgence, but the Chinese and the Indians also play a major role. And of course, India is going to benefit the most in this trade network because they're literally right in the center, and they're going to have a lot of new cities form on the coast. And one of them is going to be Calicut. And Calicut is going to grow in wealth, and they're going to have a very diverse population because they have all these merchants and sailors from different parts of the world coming in to settle in. So again, Muslim merchants, right here we see them on their ships arriving in India. So there's going to be a lot of specialized products trade. So India, for example, their main thing is going to be cotton, textiles. So they're also going to trade steel, leather, pepper. Southeast Asia, there's always going to be spices. That's going to be their number one export. In East Africa, we have slaves. Once again, we have ivory, we have gold being exported. These are the products that people want from East Africa. China is going to be silk, as always, but the new one is going to be porcelain, right? Which is what fine china is called. Dinnerware, plates, cups, that sort of stuff will be made out of porcelain. And from the Middle East, right, from Arabia, from Persia, We have horses, textiles, and other fabrics. All right. Keep in mind, of course, that these merchants, these sailors, are going to be using the monsoons, right? And the knowledge of the monsoons allows people to sail quickly from one part of the ocean to another part of the ocean at different times of the year. And you have to kind of calculate when these monsoon winds are blowing in what direction and during what time. But remember, when they sail from one part to another part, they have to stay there for a few months before they're able to sail back. And this allows the creation of these multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic cities. And for example, Muslim merchants are going to sail from Arabia, from Persia. They're going to sail all the way to South to East Africa, right? These city states that we see here in East Africa, and they're going to be there for a few months of the year. And many times they will settle down, they will marry, and start mixing in with the local population. And we see that Islam will expand throughout the Indian Ocean, will spread throughout the Indian Ocean because of these Muslims. So we see, of course, new technologies and old technologies continue to spread and diffuse throughout the Indian Ocean. The lateen sail, right, that triangular sail that maximizes the wind energy of the monsoons. The stern post rudder, which is a Chinese invention, allows people to maneuver and navigate easier their ships. The Dhows and the Junks, right? These are the two. The Junks are the ones. The Dhows are these, right? The triangular ones. These are the Arab Indian ones. The Junks are much, much, much larger. These are the Chinese ones, and these are the two major type of ships that we're going to see in the Indian Ocean. We also see the astrolabe, right, which dates back to the Greeks and the Romans. The Muslims are going to improve on the astrolabe, allowing people to calculate latitude, right, distance from the equator. And the new one is going to be the compass. Even though it was invented during the Han Chinese time, it's not going to become a much more. It's going to become much more common use during the post-classical time, and more people are able to use the magnetic compass to sail and not get lost. All right, so that's it for the second part. Thanks for watching.